Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Bahá'i Chair for Studies in Development, I would like to invite all our distinguished panelists and participants for this webinar on the theme of development and the Adivasis, building on strengths, removing barriers. This is the third in a series of webinars that the Bahá'i Chair has organized on the impact of the COVID pandemic on some of India's most vulnerable and marginalized populations. As we all know, maybe in the beginning before we begin, I just wanted to share a few of the thoughts that and issues that the Bahá'i Chair was thinking of when we came up with the idea of having this webinar. We all know that of the various populations that have whose economic and social life has been severely disrupted by the pandemic, probably one of the most vulnerable has been the Adivasis, or the indigenous communities of India. According to the statistics, again, a vast segment of this population lives in conditions that are described as being the poorest of the poor, and by all development indicators, large numbers of this social group have been placed very low in comparison with other groups and populations. To the excuse me, to a community that or a population that has already faced so many vulnerabilities, the pandemic came as a devastating blow. Of the close to 80 million migrants who left cities and went back to the rural areas after the lockdown, a vast number of them were Adivasi migrants, and studies that were done found that many of them were living in extremely difficult conditions under labor contractors in the cities. Migrants are usually less paid than non-Adivasi migrants, and their living conditions, according to some studies, have found that they often have to live on work sites and in open spaces when compared with non-Adivasi migrants. Apart from this, nearly 100 million Adivasi people make their living from the collection and sale of minor forest produce, and these were severely hit by the lockdown, which was imposed during the summer months, which is usually the prime harvesting season. And this disrupted the possibility for collecting and selling the produce. Similarly, nomadic and pastoral communities were tremendously affected because they depend on interstate and inter-district travel in order to feed their livestock and for food. And many of them found themselves stranded in other states and districts because of the lockdown, without access to food or fodder for their livestock. Apart from the loss of livelihoods, poor access to medical and health infrastructure has only further pushed them into a greater state of precarity. No doubt, addressing the economic and social injustices faced by the Adivasis would require strengthening their ownership, access, and control over land and forests, and the enhancement of their livelihood prospects. Another area which the chair has been exploring has been the need for building institutional capacity at the community level. Because a key question for the chair in all our webinars has been, how does one bring disadvantaged groups and populations into a position of greater participation in the decision-making processes that determine the kind of development policies that affect the people. And clearly one key step in this process is strengthening institutions of local governance, which would provide mechanisms for participation, decision-making, and strengthening the sense of agency of the people. One key dimension of this participation that the chair has been thinking about has been the question of how do these populations make the decision of modernization? How do they interact with these modernization processes that has been seen to adversely impact them? These communities have a wealth of cultural, artistic resources. Their traditional knowledge systems and practices have been shown to be of great value. They have spiritual and cultural values that can be an example for inclusive and just forms of community life. And yet when the question comes of integrating with a globalized world, the question is how do we make sure, how do they retain their identity? How do they ensure that interacting with these forces of globalization do not push them into a position of exploitation? How do they not succumb to the homogenizing pressures of these processes of globalization? A key question also in this process is how does one strengthen institutions that can catalog traditional knowledge systems of these indigenous peoples at the grassroots level, and have institutions of research, again at the grassroots, that can find appropriate technological solutions to their developmental needs by bringing their indigenous practices and knowledge systems in interaction with scientific methods and principles. One last comment before I hand it over to our esteemed panel. The enabling environment that will make this overcoming of oppression possible, according to the chair, is of course the need to for a concerted effort to overcome prejudice that is widely prevalent and which provides the basis for the oppression that this community faces. Overcoming prejudice is not just possible through the imposition of laws, vital as that is. Like every oppressed group, the Adivasi people face an invisible wall of structural and institutional prejudice that limits their possibilities of progress, normalizes injustices, and socializes its members into accepting a diminished conception of themselves and their potential. And social scientists have shown us how prejudice can systemically deprive those who suffer, those who are at the receiving end of it, from economic opportunities by socializing them into accepting a culture of poverty where they internalize stigma and stereotypes, and where they are deprived of access to credit and various services which belong to, usually are monopolized by certain networks. So for the chair, the overcoming of such prejudice requires a fundamental change of consciousness in society as a whole, where the oneness of the human family and the inherent value of the cultural diversity of each of its members is fervently cherished and upheld as part of our common collective heritage. The creation of such a consciousness and its manifestation in social relationships and in the structures of society is ultimately a moral challenge that society as a whole will have to face and overcome. Friends, we have a distinguished panel today, and I don't want to come in the way of the participants and the panelists. Just before we move on, a quick comment about how participants can interact with the panelists. We have a Q&A box, and you are requested to address your questions to the panelists through the Q&A box, and we will have time, hopefully in between the presentations and as well as at the end, to take your questions and comments. Our first speaker today is Mr. 𝗕𝗂𝗶𝗃𝗀𝗵 from 𝗕𝗂𝗃𝗀𝗵 and 𝗕𝗂𝗃𝗀𝗵𝗀. Mr. 𝗕𝗂𝗃𝗀𝗵 is a very well-known name in the field of development, not just in India, but also all over the world. He has authored many books, of which the most recent one that he co-authored is Churning of the Earth, and he recently co-edited a book titled 𝗗𝗂𝗵𝗴 a Post-Development Dictionary. Professor Mr. 𝗕𝗂𝗃𝗀𝗵, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arash. I'm glad you corrected the professor to Mr. Because I also wanted to start with two important caveats. Number one, I am in no way an expert on Adivasis. I have been fortunate enough to be involved with some of the Adivasi movements and helping to document and support them. And so what I'm going to speak about is actually just learning from that experience. Secondly, and very importantly, I am in no way speaking on behalf of Adivasis. I think this is a mistake that Indian civil society has made for far too long, including in international circles. A lot of the people speaking for Adivasis are non-Adivasis. And this is why, with due apologies, Arash, I was surprised when I first got your invitation to see that there was no Adivasi on the panel. I'm very glad that you did invite Archana and that she's here. So let me start with a couple of examples of initiatives on the ground of what Adivasis are doing to address some of the sorts of issues that you very rightly started with, Arash. One is a community or a set of communities we've been involved with now for the last few years in central India and 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗃 district in Maharashtra. There are 90 villages, Adivasi villages, predominantly Adivasi villages, that have got together as a 𝗗𝗲𝗃𝗀𝗵𝗃. You spoke about institutions, and this is why it's so important. Because what they've done is they've said that there'll be, of course, a Gram Sabha in each village, but individually, they find it very difficult to deal with the sorts of threats that they face from the external world. So it's much more strong if they actually have a federation of Gram Sabha. So these are part of this 𝗗𝗃𝗃𝗀𝗵𝗃, and basically in the last few years they have been number one fighting against the mining leases in the area successfully so far, but also reasserting their Adivasi cultural identity, trying to figure out how education can change, taking full control over the forests as community forests under the Forest Rights Act, restarting some of their traditional yatras, for instance, through which they're able to also communicate values and history and so on to the younger generations, and many other things. And also, interestingly enough, recognizing the fact that in Adivasis, even though the situation of women is way better than in non-Adivasi societies, it is still unequal. And so actually having separate processes of women's empowerment so that they can also speak equally in the Gram Sabhas and the 𝗗𝗃𝗃𝗀𝗵𝗃. Move over to Jharkhand, and we've had the Pattalgadi movement, very controversial as we all know. But one of the slogans I found there, which I thought was very interesting and for all of us to learn, was Gram Sabha Lok Sabha se upar. And this is actually the spirit of the constitution. If it's we the people, the Lok Sabha, who we elect, should actually be subservient to us and not the other way around, which is unfortunately how it has become. And about 30 years back, a village in 𝗥𝗲𝗺𝗺, back in 𝗥𝗲𝗺𝗺, had also already declared that even as we elect the government in Mumbai and Delhi, in our village, we are the government. Hamare gaon mein hum hi sarkar. Now, I think what these sorts of movements, and there are many others, tell us is a very different story from what unfortunately has happened to Adivasis in India. As according to me, Adivasis have still not gained independence. India, what we notionally call India, gained independence from British colonial rule. But in the whole process of doing that, in fact, there was very little discussion and consultation with the Adivasis on what is the kind of governance that they wanted, what is the kind of so-called development. In fact, development was not used as a word at that point, it came later. But what is the kind of economic future, political future that they wanted? There were some discussions in the Constituent Assembly and so on, but very little actual on-ground consultation. And in fact, in some senses, the process of colonization that began even before the British came, then during British, and then post-independence has continued. I would call that internal colonization, and we have seen that happening in many parts of the world, but it also happens in India, even if we don't want to recognize that. If you look at colonization, the definition of colonization is a process of settling among and establishing control over indigenous people of an area. And that's exactly what dominant society in India has done in all of the Adivasi areas, including central India and many parts of the northeast. Now, there's three or four different ways in which colonization takes place, and all of them have been applied. One is political and administrative control, which we have taken. We've taken it sometimes peacefully, sometimes with the help of police and army, increasingly, unfortunately, with armed police and with armed forces, armed police in central India, armed forces in northeast, and so on. But also with the imposition of a single governance model, not recognizing the fact that Adivasis have their own customary forms of political governance and management and so on. We've said, okay, panchayats everywhere, etc. Barring a few exceptional areas where, like parts of Arunachal and all, or Nagaland, where they've been allowed to continue their traditional customary governance. I'm not suggesting that customary governance was always great, but I'm simply saying that this imposition of a single way of how do you manage your affairs is also part of a political colonization process. Then there's economic colonization, which is number one, what does it mean to be developed, or what is human progress, is a single definition, which in fact the West imposed on us. We happily took it, and then we have imposed on Adivasi communities. And this means, therefore, exactly what you said in terms of whether it's modernization, what do you think of as being developed, what is poor and not poor, all of these things actually become imposed from above. And then you go further and say, okay, we are now going to take control over your land, over your forests, over your water, violate all the constitutional provisions, which in fact did not allow for those sorts of things, bypass them, or now increasingly modify the laws so that in fact it's legally also possible, impose processes of industrialization. You mentioned displacement. I think there was a planning commission figure from about 2 or 3 decades back, about 60 million people in India being displaced, 40% of whom were Adivasis and Dalits, even though the population of Adivasis especially is only 7% or 8% or whatever. So disproportionately, it is in fact Adivasis that are being physically uprooted, or who are being dispossessed of their means of livelihood, their means of survival, in the name of development. And we therefore always call this development as destruction or violence. The third form of colonization, probably the most insidious, is cultural. And here, this whole narration of Adivasis have to be assimilated into the mainstream. First of all, this whole notion of mainstream is such a horrible one. And sometimes when people ask me saying, when is environment going to be mainstream? When are alternatives going to be mainstreamed? I say, no, mainstream is not the idea. The idea is there are hundreds of different small streams and they should coexist. Otherwise, one mainstream is going to destroy everything else, even if it's coming from the human rights and environmentalist lobby. And this cultural assimilation or cultural imposition has happened especially and very insidiously through the education system. The schooling, or the factory schools as they're called, including the one in the state Archana is from, maybe she can talk about the infamous KISS institution, and there's many others. We have worked in some of the ashram shalas, as they call them, in Adivasi areas, and it's really horrible. I mean, of course, some of them are nice and kind and so on, but there's no space there for Adivasi languages, for Adivasi knowledge, etc., to be part of the system. It's really the imposition of whether it's Marathi or Hindi or whatever it is, and knowledge coming in from outside. And now increasingly we see, of course, the imposition of religions. Of course, we've seen that in the past in many parts of India, but now with the increasing agenda of Hindutva, we are seeing that so-called 𝗕𝗂𝗃𝗃𝗀𝗃𝗃 is where Adivasis are supposed to be coming back into the Hindu fold, which is most ridiculous. Now, just a couple of other points and then I'll end. I think in the process of all of this happening, the aspirations of the Adivasi communities, and especially of the young people in Adivasis communities, and I'm sure Archana will speak more about that, have also got, in some senses, let me say, it's the oppressed are dreaming the same dreams as the oppressors. And in the sense that, okay, I also want to be developed, I also want to have a PhD, I want to build, I mean, I'm not blaming them at all. I think this is very understandable given the kind of impositions and brainwashing that's taken place. And so this is one of the biggest challenges. If we're talking about Adivasis being truly independent, one of the biggest challenges is how does one enable a process by which young people are able to go back into their own Adivasi roots, their own Adivasi ecologies, plus learn from outside, and then have a free choice of what direction they want to take. How do they want to proceed from there, rather than simply this whole thing that my Adivasi roots are backward, they're primitive, I need to get rid of them, and I have to get into the modern world. This is a huge challenge. In the midst of all of this, COVID, and you already laid it out very well, so I don't need to go into that, has of course created incredible vulnerabilities. And I think, but what's also very interesting here is that where Adivasis have been less vulnerable, and we have some case studies on that, is where they have actually retained control over their lands, forests, and other natural resources, and are relatively intact community systems. So for instance, in the same communities in central India and in 𝗥𝗲𝗃𝗃𝗃 that I mentioned, because they had been able to take control over their forests over the last few years and gain livelihoods from that, and also gain and revenues, which were then put into village funds, when the migrant workers in the villages came back, they were able to deal with them and help them in a much better way without actually having to depend on the government, because they had the funds to be able to provide them relief packages and so on. But also because the forests were there, they had backup nutrition, they had backup food, they had things that they could actually depend on. And of course, the NTFP trade issue was a huge one, but where they could localize some of that trade, again, they were much better off. And so, so the issue of crisis and vulnerability has to be also looked at from the point of view of how truly autonomous are Adivasi communities with respect to their economy, their politics, their culture, and so on. And this is where the counter currents are so important, which is why I started with 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗃 and 𝗦𝘁𝗃𝗃 and 𝗵𝗏𝗃𝗃 and so on, because it is these counter movements which will be hopefully showing us the direction. Because finally, it's the mobilization of people, including the institutional structures you mentioned, that becomes so important. Laws and policies can help. So the Forest Rights Act, one with very hard-fought battles and struggles for over two or three decades, is one of those laws which tries to reverse the process of colonization. But unfortunately, as we know, only 3 to 4% of its potential has actually been actualized after like 12, 13 years of implementation. And that's because the same state that brought in the law does not actually want it implemented. Secondly, we need to look at, thirdly, we need to look at alternative education and health initiatives. And there are again many in India that can be learned from. There's, for instance, Aadhaar Shila in Madhya Pradesh, there's SEC-Mall in Ladakh, there's the Tribal Health Institute in Tamil Nadu, there's many more. I'll put up the link to Vikalp Sangam website, in which we have many of these stories and case studies. And I think learning from that, we will have to push for changes on the ground and on policies in order to see what are these alternative ways by which Adivasi health systems, Adivasi ways of learning, Adivasi languages are brought center stage into the system of education and health. Which is not to say you reject everything from modern life. Of course, what is relevant should be brought, but it has to be built on the base of what are Adivasi roots themselves. And finally, then, it's not just what's happening in Adivasi areas and to Adivasis, it's all of us having to transform our lives, which means actually start fundamentally questioning our own consumption patterns, the ways in which we have thought of as development and progress. Unless that also gets transformed, Adivasi communities and societies will continue to be swamped by the dominant society, which means, and I've been asking universities in India, for instance, saying, why do only PhD professors teach in your universities? Why can't you have 𝗕𝗂𝗃𝗶𝗃𝗀𝗵 from 𝗕𝗂𝗃𝗂 or Archana Soreng or somebody else coming and teaching you? Because these are people who got the experience and the expertise and the Adivasi science and knowledge to be able to teach students, and they will teach them from a different perspective, which is what students need to learn. So in all institutions of knowledge, learning and education, we need to bring the Adivasi voice and the Adivasi knowledge and the Adivasi languages into center stage. One of the things I found very fascinating in this, in the Bhasha Academy, Adivasi Academy in Gujarat near Baroda, was that they have a small school. I'll just end in a minute. They have a small school, and one of the rules there is that, and this is mostly Adivasi kids who come there, is that if there's an Adivasi child who comes with a language that the teachers don't know, the teacher has to learn that language and not impose their language on those Adivasi kids. That's the way in which we have to transform our so-called mainstream institutions also. And obviously then this is all part of a much more fundamental struggle to transform what we mean by development, progress, who controls the economy, who controls politics, etc., which is a much larger topic I won't get into. But yeah, with that, I'll end. I just wanted to put in these, and I again want to say and stress that this is not in any way speaking on behalf of Adivasis. It's just from my experience and a few thoughts. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Ashish, for flagging these fundamental questions, which I think as we go ahead, our other speakers will help us think more about their implications, maybe unpack some of these questions. I don't know if we necessarily have answers, but I'm sure there'll be a much more granular and much more nuanced understanding the issues and some of the principles involved in addressing it. So our next speaker in the panel is Dr. Rahul Banerjee, who is a social activist and secretary of the Mahila 𝗥𝗲𝗃𝗵𝗃 Samiti. He's from Indore, my fellow Indori, so I'm happy to see you on this panel.
Okay, good morning, everybody. We in Mahila 𝗥𝗲𝗃𝗵𝗃 Samiti, which is our latest organization, there are other organizations that I am associated with, which I'll talk about progressively later, have been saying for quite some time that, the way the human race is devastating nature, there's going to be a backlash. And what we have seen, COVID is just the trailer. It's just going to go on. So far, we had droughts and floods. Now we have had COVID. And if you see, the great thing about COVID was that the lockdown resulted in, our environmental parameters going up. The rivers getting cleaned, air getting cleaned and all that. So COVID in that sense, more than floods and droughts, was a more succinct kind of attack, counter-attack from nature. And we're going to see more of this as we go ahead. But the tragedy is that, whether it's droughts or floods or whether it's COVID, the people who suffer from it are those who are least destructive of nature. People like us who are living in cities, we are destroying nature much more with our lifestyle and the way we live and where we work and all that. the people who are living close to nature, especially the Adivasis, of course, the macro system is such, something that Ashish touched upon, that the macro system is such that even Adivasis today, they are harming nature, because just for survival purpose, they have to do some things which are harmful to nature. But generally, because they're at a subsistence level, even today, 90%, 95% of the Adivasis are at subsistence level. Only a few people who have got the advantage of reservation and got into jobs and think they have come into this modern system of which we are part. But even they are the ones who are suffering the most, whether it's COVID or droughts or floods and things like that. But what we have done, so what our work is for 30 years. I've been working for 30 years, more than 30 years, 35 years in this Western Madhya Pradesh region among the 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 Adivasis. So like Ashish, I just came there to work with them, and I learned from them a lot, and what I most learned from them was their subsistence lifestyle. They are close to nature, and they know the limits of nature, and they keep within those limits. Try to keep within those limits as far as possible. So that is a beautiful kind of relationship. So their culture, their agriculture, their forest relationships, the way they use their forests, they're all very sustainable. So in our organizations, I started with the organization called 𝗕𝗂𝗶𝗃𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗃. This is the trade union of Adivasis in Alirajpur district. So that work started in 1985. And so when we learned from them, they have these communitarian processes. There's a custom within the Adivasis, 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 Adivasis in Western Madhya Pradesh called 𝗕𝗂𝗃𝗃𝗃, in which it's a communitarian effort in which it's a non-monetized economy. The traditional Adivasi economy is a non-monetized economy. So they don't have money. So when they want to do some work, they get together. The whole community pools together their labor, and then they do the work. If it might be weeding on somebody's farm, or doing some soil conservation work, but they all get together, do that work in somebody's farm. Next day they'll do it in somebody else's farm, or build a house or whatever. So this traditional culture that was there of community service, community work, we leveraged that. So in Alirajpur, this whole thing, when we started work in Alirajpur, the forest department, there was no all these Forest Rights Act and all, as Ashish was saying, it came much later because of organizations like ours. Many organizations across the country, the ones in Meghalaya and various places in India, they got together and fought this battle and got the Forest Rights Act. But even before that, from 1985, we had this problem, the Indian Forest Act. That Indian Forest Act, from the latest version was that 1927 version. The British, it makes the Adivasi a thief in his own backyard. So that's the struggle, that you have, the law is such that it alienates Adivasis from the forest. So the thing was that struggle against that, get a control of the forest, and then use the forest in the traditional sense, in the way that the Adivasis have been using for so many millennia. So that was the thing, and that's a great success that we achieved in Alirajpur. Even before the Forest Rights Act, we got control of the forest, fighting. There were a lot of fights and all that, going to jail and things like that. But then the Adivasis showed their strength, and so they got control of the forest, and they rejuvenated the forest, the streams. They did soil and conservation work and all that kind of stuff. Crores of rupees, and it's all voluntary. The amount of investment, if we now do it in money terms, it's in crores of rupees, but it's all voluntary, people getting together and doing it. And because that's part of their culture. The thing, what Ashish was very, very important point that he made, that the market and the education system, everything is breaking that culture. The police is a major, this thing is the way they may break up the society. They have their own dispute resolution mechanisms, which are very democratic. But these police fellows, they go in and spoil that. And then that creates a lot of problem. A society that is a communitarian, that has very little conflict, it becomes conflict-ridden. People are fighting against each other and all these kind of things. So to prevent that, you have to revive these communitarian systems, and that is what we did. And so that was a big success in Alirajpur. Even today, you can go and see. And then that helps when you have a communitarian system, a very powerful communitarian system where people are together. Then they can implement the laws also, whether it's anti-Sahukar, the anti-Sahukar laws, the debt is a major way in which Adivasis have been shattered, right from the beginning, right from the Jharkhand and everywhere, all these problems are there in Orissa and everywhere. So debt is a major problem and that has to be tackled. So these people, they got together and tackled because the laws are there. There are so many stringent laws for control of debt, control of usury, but they are not implemented. So when there's a organization there, they can force the government, and so the debt, all the Sahukars, they were sidelined. All this problem of debt was totally solved. So this whole thing, when it's there, so then when a law comes, when a law like Forest Rights Act finally comes after such a long struggle, so then it's implemented. So Alirajpur district has one of the best implementations in the whole of the country. The thousands and thousands of people have got the individual rights. And unfortunately, the community rights, they have stalled. The government doesn't want to give community rights to the people, but effectively people are in control of those forests. So it doesn't matter. The forest department has been completely sidelined out there. So this whole thing is there. The institutions that Arash was talking about, that what will be the institutions that can ensure that, we have sustainable and equitable development. That you sustain nature, and within your society you have equitable. So then you have these traditional panchayats, and then there's this another movement that took place, for traditional panchayats in the tribal areas. So we are in 5th schedule areas, as you must all know that India has 2 tribal areas, the 6th schedule and the 5th schedule areas. So I will not talk about the 6th schedule areas because there's nobody here from the 6th schedule areas. I'll concentrate on the 5th schedule areas in which we work. And so within 5th schedule areas, the 5th schedule provisions themselves are very powerful. So we tried to implement that, but that because we are very small unit in just one district, we couldn't do something. But then PESA came, the Panchayat Extension to Schedule Areas Act, which we are very much a part of that. That whole process. We are part of the Forest Rights Act also, the process of getting it legalized, and then this Panchayat Extension to Schedule Areas Act. That also we work with all those other organizations throughout the country. And PESA came in, and Madhya Pradesh, luckily, due to the intervention of Dr. B.D. Sharma, and he managed to influence 𝗕𝗂𝗃𝗃, who was the Chief Minister at that time, to make a lot of amendments to the Panchayati Raj Act in accordance with PESA. Actually, PESA itself is not enough. PESA is a central provision from the constitution. But unless the Panchayati Raj Act of the state is amended to take in all those provisions of PESA, you cannot, implement PESA. But luckily in Madhya Pradesh that was done. So then we tried to implement PESA also, and that led to a huge problem. And then there were a lot of this thing, and the state doesn't want to give those powers and things like that. So there was a lot of confrontation. People died in police firing and things like that. But effectively, what has happened is that we have managed, again, informally. They have not, within PESA provisions, all those things that Gram Sabha has become. Actually, if that Gram Sabha becomes a recognized unit, then whatever funds are coming for rural development or tribal development, they can come to that Gram Sabha directly, instead of this system of where you have Sarpanch and then Sarpanch is controlled. Sarpanch himself doesn't have. Throughout this country, the panchayats, the Sarpanch has very little power. It's all with those fellow bureaucrats in the panchayat, block development officer and all that. They have so many controls that the Sarpanch, very few Sarpanches, especially Adivasi Sarpanches, are able to do anything. But if it comes to the Gram Sabha, then the Sarpanch also is not necessary. You have direct democracy in the Gram Sabha, and within the PESA, Gram Sabha is defined as the small hamlet. It's not the normal Gram Sabha like in Madhya Pradesh. There are 2 or 3 villages together in one Gram Sabha. So then it's impossible to get all those people together in Gram Sabha to negotiate something or decide on something. But within PESA, it is that the hamlet, the small hamlet in one place which has been a recognized unit, that can declare itself as a Gram Sabha, and then whatever funds that are supposed to come for development, that comes directly to the Gram Sabha, and then the Gram Sabha can, because they are a small unit, they can sit every day in the evening they can have a meeting and decide what to do and what not to do and things like that. So that whole thing of direct democracy, that is the core of Adivasi life. That is what I have learned. If I have learned anything in all these years, it is this thing of direct democracy that is there within the Adivasi community, and that should inform the whole. What Gandhi's principle of oceanic circles was, that the whole system should be bottom up, not top down. We have had a top down system. You trickle down development, useless. How can anything trickle down? The guy on top, why will he allow anything to trickle down? So nothing trickles down. You have this term that, you have trickle down and all that, nothing. It should be bottom up. Trickle up. We will decide how much resources to give to you, to somebody else above me. That's the way it should go. But it doesn't. Taxes go to the center, and then the center squeezes the states, and the states squeeze the panchayats. So eventually you don't have anything. So this whole system is wrong. And it has to be changed. So what Arash was saying, what is the system? So we have to have this oceanic circles kind of system that Gandhiji had suggested, that was sidelined totally. It was never, implemented, put into the Panchayati Raj, was put into the, directive principles of state policy. Right in the beginning, right to education, right to health, and right to work, and right to self-governance. 4 fundamental rights that should have been there within the fundamental rights chapter. They put it into the directive principles of state policy chapter, that is not justiciable, and they never directed policy in this country. Policy in this country was directed by Tatas and Birlas and all these people for their benefit, and that is how all the development went. So, and all the people, let alone Adivasi is right at the bottom. Even other communities, they have not got anything. Whether it's Dalits, OBCs, or there's a small 2-3% on top, who have been skimming the resources right from the British times, and they have been even before that, thousands of years. We all know that, Savarna domination and things like that. All that has gone on. So that, how to counter the thing is that you have to have this strong Adivasi. It's difficult in other places to do this, but with Adivasis, because they have this thousands of years they have been living like this, it is possible to do it. And if you step in and do it, then you can really do it. So another thing that both Arash and Ashish mentioned was about culture. Very important thing. See, this is the big problem, is that today globally, it's all homogenized. A culture that comes in through the TV. 1930, TV was discovered, and it is the biggest discovery for advancing capitalism and this destructive modern development. It is poured in from TV. Everybody watches TV, and now that's gone into social media also. You have all these bloody TikTok and things like that and everything. Now TikTok has been banned, but what is happening is on Facebook is beaming short videos at me. All abominable stuff that comes in. I don't know. I never was on TikTok, so I didn't know what was going on. Now, because TikTok has gone, all those guys have come onto Facebook and they are beaming at me. And this fellow comes in Facebook. Every time I open my wall, the first thing I get is all these kind of useless videos that are coming in, So this is what is dominating people, even in Adivasi areas. It's all come in. It's everybody on his phone and everything. They don't see anything else. They see all these videos and they are downloading and things and all that. And all the data that is, that is being given is wasted on all this kind of thing. So how in that kind of a situation do you, protect your culture? So in that respect, in Bhil Adivasi areas from 1990s, early 1990s, the Bhil Adivasis have had many movements, in the Bhil Adivasi areas. It started with Maharashtra, Shramik Sangatana and Kaluram Dhodre Bhumi Sena in Thane among the Warlis and all these people. They had these the organizations that were fighting for Adivasi rights and all that. And all these people, they got, and in Gujarat we had, Ashok Chaudhary and all these people that were there. They all got together and they formed the Adivasi 𝗥𝗲𝗃𝗿𝗃, and they said that, we have all these strong points in our culture. So we develop a modern system in which we take things from modernity. We need all these things from modernity. Something we need, numeracy, literacy, and all these things. We can't do without that in a modern society. But we have all these strengths in our culture. We'll put them all together, and we'll have this Adivasi 𝗥𝗲𝗃𝗃𝗃. So that Adivasi 𝗥𝗲𝗃𝗃𝗃 started in 1990s, early 1990s, and today it has millions of followers throughout the western Madhya Pradesh region. It's a big organization, and they don't take funds from anybody. They have their own funds, and their whole organization is totally Adivasi based. They have their own intellectuals, everything, their pedagogy, everything, their schools, everything, and the culture. So what is very important is that in Western Madhya Pradesh, the culture, the Bhil culture is there. All their songs and those things, they sing their own songs with modern instruments. They have DJs, you know, those sound systems and everything is there. They are using guitars and all that thing. But the lyrics and the music, that is theirs, and it's so strong that even mainstream society dances to them, because they're a dance based. You know, their lyrics are their music is very simple. It doesn't have this big 7-scale kind of thing. It's just 2 or 3. Their sargam is just 2 or 3 things, and it's all rhythm dependent. So and dance, you know, so that music now, even the mainstream people in their shadis and all that, they dance to these tunes. So that is
Rahul, if you can just conclude in 1 minute.
This is the last point that I was trying to make, that in culture also, these people, the Bhil Adivasis, they have been able to retain. So whether it is their livelihoods or culture and all that, because of their inherent systems that are there, which have been rejuvenated by various organizations that are working in this area, they have been able to sustain that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rahul. This was again a very thought-provoking, in a sense, empirically grounded discussion of the issues, and also some very heartening examples, which I hope we can go into a little during our discussion time. I would now like to request our third speaker to make her comments, and hopefully after the third speaker we can take a few questions from participants. Our third speaker is Ms. Priyanka Jain, who is a labor researcher and activist with the Ajivika Bureau. Please.
Thank you. I would sort of like to focus on the issue of labor markets and migration, and the intersection of that with Adivasi communities, because when we talk about how capitalist development has affected Adivasi communities, of course, a large part of that is the dispossession that these communities have faced from their land and their forest. But in contemporary economy, a very central part of the extraction that happens has got to do through the process of labor markets, has got to do through laboring kind of processes. So it's not just dispossession that happened from their material basis of life, but it's also ongoing kind of dispossession that happens when it comes to extraction from the laboring bodies. And therefore it becomes very important to sort of look at labor markets and what goes on within these laboring processes. And I speak from the experience of working in southern Rajasthan, which is an Adivasi, and this is not very well known about Rajasthan. Rajasthan is just sort of imagined as this desert kind of area, whereas southern Rajasthan is actually a forested sort of area. And this is the Aravalli region, which is very heavily dominated by various kinds of Adivasi communities, Bhil, Gamethi, Karasia, Meena communities. And as was mentioned by previous speakers as well, the kind of original sin, the sort of like the first displacement sort of happened during the colonial era. In this place, even though it was a princely state, there was indirect British rule, but all of the legislative measures which criminalized Adivasis, the existence of Adivasis in forest areas and kind of led to their displacement was effective in these areas as well. And that kind of, and from there was like a long colonial, post-colonial kind of history with the Indian state, much like the British kind of colonial regime, which continued these forms of dispossession and converted Adivasis into this wage-dependent masses. Why this is relevant when we talk about labor markets today is that the kind of social dynamics of how economic resources came to be controlled over a period of time kind of continues in contemporary economy. So during colonial era or post-colonial era, when mining began, when commercial extraction of forests began, the dominant classes of this region kind of became brokers of that particular process. And it is the same communities who have reappeared in this migration kind of economy as Seths, as Sahukars, as Thekadars, who continue to control the social and the economic life of Adivasi communities over here. And continue to make the labor market process a very social process in which the relations of subjugation can be seen to be continued from the social domain to the economic domain, kind of merging the two, which also kind of makes response and resistance so much harder, and which is why it's quite important to kind of understand the historical trajectory of how these labor markets came to be composed in these sorts of segments. Now, we know, so the reality today is that, while we definitely need this kind of transformative agenda, this political transformative agenda, where we talk about how the material basis of life of Adivasis can be reconstituted again, the lands and the forests be brought back, etc. The very harsh reality today is that large chunks of these communities in central India, in South India, we definitely see that where we work in Rajasthan, Gujarat kind of areas, is heavily dependent on wage, and not just wage labor, but on migration and on seasonal circular forms of migration. And while we kind of need the kind of transformative agenda that everybody has been talking about, we also kind of need a bit of a reformist agenda which looks at the labor market, which makes the labor market slightly less corrosive a place for Adivasis to be in, which makes the gains from participating in these laboring processes a little bit more, it should work a little bit more for them. That's sort of, I think, something that needs to be brought to an agenda, which is not, it is not antithetical to the agenda of lands and forests. I think it kind of needs to be seen parallelly, because it is a huge reality of how Adivasi communities, their livelihood baskets is formed today. And we know that wage relations are exploitative. Wage is about alienation, and it is extremely alienating the ways the segments of the labor market in which Adivasis work. The work is, it is so harsh, it is so hazardous, it happens in such super exploitative manners that is extremely alienating. But I think that is exactly why, and because there is such great dependence on these labor markets, the agenda of reforming the agenda of labor policies becomes a very, very important one when we talk about Adivasi communities and their well-being. So if we look at India's labor markets, just to sort of unpack that a little bit, India's labor markets, as it's been internationally understood, is one of the most segmented, extremely unequal labor markets in the world. And if we disaggregate a little bit, even official government data kind of proves that Adivasis occupy absolutely the bottommost rungs, along with Dalits and religious communities. Child labor, they're basically in the same bracket as child and bonded labor very often. It's the same kind of segments that often they occupy. And over here, what you see is it's actually called super exploitation in Marxian terms, what they kind of experience, because if you look at the intensity of the work, the mental and the physical exertion, which goes on not just because of the direct kind of burden of the work, but also what it takes to stay alive in extremely hazardous workplace settings. If you kind of combine the exertion, the cognitive exertion, the mental physical exertion that happens, it is probably the most excruciating of all communities in the labor market. If you look at the extension of the workday, which is not just the overtime that you do at your work site, but also because you have been completely abandoned by the state and the employer with no basic kind of facilities, what does it do to your work hours in a day? And what is the gendered burden of that? So what we find, for example, is that work sites, workplaces, where there are no provisions, it basically means that the women, the Adivasi women from those households, have to work an additional 3.5 or 4 hours simply because of lack of services, because then fetching water, cooking food, all of those things take so much more time. So all of this has a gendered burden as well of what happens inside of labor markets. And if you look at the wage differentials, again, this has been proven by labor economists and labor anthropologists. For the same work, Adivasis are likely to be paid lesser than other communities, even SCs, even Dalits, if you in some labor markets. So what do we do about this? When it comes to labor markets, how should we approach the question? I think there are two parts to this that I'd like to highlight. The first thing is that, are we engaging, when we talk about Adivasi communities, do we engage with the issue of labor policies? Are the two kind of movements, are the two kind of sectors and domains speaking to each other? So today, when the labor policies are being completely eroded, it has been eroded by the neoliberal regime for a while, but right now they are on a particular type of assault and a particular type of attack. Is the backlash or is the resistance of that coming just from the labor movement, or is it also coming from the Dalit movement? Is it also coming from the Adivasi movement? Do we have intersectionalities? Are we speaking to each other about these issues? I think that's one thing that we need to talk about, because erosion of labor rights is not just, is an Adivasi issue as well. And I think it is only from the perspective of Adivasi Dalit communities can we talk about the particularly social nature of labor markets and how the relations of subjugation are actually social in nature. This perspective can be best brought by these movements. I think the second issue is of mobilization, is of unionization, and is of forms of resistance. And what we see, and this is something for the labor movement to reflect on, I think, is that when we look at trade unions, when we look at workers' movements, there's very, very little representation of both Dalits and Adivasis, but particularly of Adivasis. And I'm not just speaking about lack of numbers, lack of leadership. If we look at the language of the labor movement, if we look at its discourse, if we look at its agendas, it tends to be a bit preset. It is very often found that these are not spaces where, and I say this from direct personal experience of working with unions, of working with sangatans, which are both, even if the sangathan is composed of Dalit and Adivasi workers, that is it. Even in a space of that nature, it can be so difficult, and we know so little of how to make that space a space where real agency, real innovation, or real ownership of the discourse can take place from the Adivasi communities. And I don't think the development sector knows how to do it very well. I don't think the labor movements know how to do this very well. So how do you kind of build spaces where a genuine conversation can take place? And as far as the labor movement is concerned, or labor kind of working class struggles are concerned, there would have to be coexistence of the Adivasi communities with other communities, because they all kind of are enmeshed together in the labor markets, and the working class struggles are therefore enmeshed. So how do you kind of create these, cross-community conversations in which the Adivasi voice is not co-opted, is not lost in the hegemonic kind of space that exists very much in the labor movement as well? And that's something for the labor movement to reflect on, and I don't think we have the pedagogy or the understanding of what that even means. To bring it to kind of, to change our methods, our rules of engagement, or the way we do praxis. I think the second kind of issue that I'd like to bring over here, talk about a little bit, is that again, when we talk about the agenda, with Adivasi communities, and I agree that it is not for us to speak for the agenda, but even to the extent that the agenda is discussed, what I find at large is that we speak very little of urban areas. It's almost as if Adivasis don't exist in urban areas, which is not true actually. Because if you look at the migration patterns, if you look at the construction sector, for example, very significant part of the construction sector's neighboring communities come from Adivasi areas. So if I take the example of 𝗕𝗏𝗃𝗃 city, which is where and a lot of Adivasis from southern Rajasthan go to Gujarat, various cities of Gujarat, and 𝗕𝗏𝗃 being one of the main destinations. 80% of 𝗕𝗏𝗃𝗃 city's construction sector, and the construction sector is the linchpin of Gujarat's development, of 𝗕𝗏𝗃𝗃 city's boom. 80% of the labor for the construction sector of the city comes from the Bhil Adivasi communities that kind of neighbor, from MP, Rajasthan, as well as Gujarat. If you look at overall migration patterns of women in the country, feminist labor economists have shown that 20% of migrant women actually come from Adivasi communities, which is way above their share of the overall population. So, and they're all in the city. So, we directly work with Adivasi communities that have spent 20, 30 years kind of living in 𝗕𝗏𝗃𝗃. They'll go and they'll come back, they'll go and they'll come back. But when we speak of Ahmedabad's urban poverty, when we speak of Ahmedabad's governance, for example, there is zero mention of Adivasi communities. There is no imagination that the city has of the fact that these populations live and work inside of these cities. The whole discourse around urban poor, the whole discourse around urban governance is completely delinked from this agenda. And I think the reason for that is also because when we talk about urban poor, the imagination is very much limited to urban slums. You know, we think slums is poverty, but actually, for an Adivasi in a city, living in a slum is like a dream come true. You know, living it in the slums is like making it in the city. Most Adivasis live inside of construction sites, inside of hazardous factories, and completely in open spaces. The settlements tend to be completely different. And the extent to which they are delinked in these resources from any of its state kind of initiatives is actually really absurd. It's a very absurd sort of state in which, complete state of suspension in which they live. And it's also because the urban governance kind of discourse has become very technocratic. It rarely speaks of even local governance in the urban areas, but even to the extent that it does, Adivasis don't feature in it. How much are we trying to make it part of the urban kind of conversations is, I think, something that needs to be spoken about a little bit more. Because again, when we talk about intergenerational change within the Adivasi communities as well, I mean, of course, there is internalization of your oppression, there is change in your aspirations because modernity is kind of like, imposed on you, etc. But I personally feel, and I feel this based on my own interactions with a lot of young Adivasi boys especially, that it's not just false consciousness. It's not just that they don't, that they don't understand who is oppressing them or what it is that they want. There is a genuine desire to be in cities, to kind of strike some sort of a life between villages and cities. They don't view their rural life maybe the way the generations above them did. So to the extent that there is a flux within these communities as well, to the extent that wage relations, wage labor, and an urban life is to some extent becoming a part of the urban kind of communities, we need to bring these conversations, the trickiness, the tensions of those conversations within this, within this agenda. And I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Priyanka. This was a very, very rich presentation. So I see we have two questions. First one says the reality. Well, there is one which has been answered by Ashish, but I'll just read it in case anyone else wants to respond to it. It says, thank you, Ashish sir and Rahul, for sharing your learning from the rich experience you have had. My question to the panel is, how can Adivasi knowledge systems and practices be integrated with scientific methods and principles so that they can take advantage of science and technology, but from a position of strength and without losing their sense of agency? So I think Ashish has responded, but I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on this. Rahul, you are mute. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Sorry. So what Ashish has mentioned, that the school system that is there at present, that is totally unsuitable. It's a totally unscientific school system. So right from the beginning, this synergy that you were speaking of between Adivasi knowledge and the modern knowledge, that has to be established on a level platform. You can't have a situation in which the modern system looks on the Adivasi system from a top-down perspective. So that has to start at the school level only, but that is not there at the moment. So how will that synergy come about, where the Adivasis understand what is modern science, what are the principles of modern science, and the modern science understands how the Adivasis, their empirical systems work, and then how the two can come together. That is non-existent at present.
There is another question which says, the participant says, the reality within which Adivasis live in now has drastically changed, as you all have mentioned. They are increasingly interconnected to the modern world and the changing landscape of socio-political issues. What are some of the practical steps you think that can be taken by both the Adivasi community and the institutions so as to initiate a constructive and developing conversation about their place and role in society? At what level do you think this conversation can take place? What role do you think reconstruction of educational systems would have in this conversation? So I think all the speakers have, in a sense so far, have touched on this. One question that to me it seemed that comes from the three presentations we have so far is there's this question of how does one view change? In other words, is it a fundamental systemic change, which, like was being shared earlier, one needs to think of a new vision of development, in which both the Adivasi people and non-Adivasis embrace a new vision. In other words, it's not just a project of uplifting the oppressed, which is, it is a necessity, but it's not as if the state of the oppressor is not problematic. And so in a sense, you are saying that the whole of society needs to evolve to another level, which is, I think, what Priyanka's discussion then says, is that, well, when at least that's what I read in it, is that, but then you also have to look at where we are situated, where people are right now, where this population is. And there's also a need for a reformist position where you think of incremental change, you think of changes in things that can be done on the ground. So in a sense, it seems to me there is this, I don't know if it's not a dichotomy, but at least there's this duality between seeking a fundamental transformation of one type or the other, and of approaching it in a more incremental manner and saying that, well, one needs to go one at a time, solve the problem from within the system. So I don't know if any of the speakers want to respond to this. And then education seems to be somehow at the center of it, because it's the system of socialization, the pedagogy, how do you raise, what is the system of knowledge that you indoctrinate young people in, curriculum, pedagogy. So I just want to open this question to speak.
Can I have a go, Ash?
Sure, yes.
Okay, of course, we need several days of webinars to begin to respond to such a fundamental question. But just a few thoughts from my side. I don't think it's an either or. I think the points that Priyanka made are absolutely important in terms of dealing with the here and now, which is with regard to labor rights and the dignity of labor and the horrible conditions in which Adivasis and Dalits and so on are working in industrial zones, in cities, and even back in their own villages. And but even as we do that, even as we fight for, say, the proper implementation or stronger laws on labor and so on, or things like the Forest Rights Act, I don't think it's a contradiction to simultaneously also articulate and seek the fundamental transformations in politics and economics that we are seeking. So as an example, if we say, yes, the labor is there, it needs those rights, but at the same time, let's work for an economic system that revitalizes the villages and the Adivasi areas in such a way that people have the option of going back if they want. Or for instance, the millions who have gone back don't necessarily have to come back to the cities and industrial zones. Many of them don't want to. We have seen in many communities people saying, we don't want to go back, but do we have an option to do something in our own village? And that's where the fundamental shifts happen. And so, for instance, we are arguing that the so-called the so-called Atmanirbhar Bharat package, which is actually very little Atma and all Nirbharta on the government, has to be fundamentally transformed. It needs to actually be about providing support and propping up the nature and natural resource-based livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people, the crafts, all the different sectors that people, marginalized peoples are involved with special focus, of course, on women and Adivasis and so on. That's a movement that has to be had. This particular government is unfortunately not listening, but we still have to have that demand and that pressure, and show the examples where, in fact, and which is why I mentioned the Central India examples, and even Rahul spoke about the fact that where this approach has been taken because of people's movements, or because sometimes there is, occasionally there's a positive government effort, there is much greater resilience. People are not having necessarily to move out of the villages because of distress. They might want to move, that's a different issue, but not out of distress. And where they've gone back, there is a certain community spirit, resilience, and resources available to be able to absorb them. So the recovery or stimulus package, for instance, again, that can be seen as both reform and fundamental shift. I don't think there's a dichotomy here. There could be a dichotomy eventually if we say that we don't need a state. As an anarchist, Gandhi would probably say we don't need a state. Maybe even I will say that. And that then, of course, is talking about long-term shift in which we become, millions of autonomous units linked up in these oceanic circles, which Rahul spoke about, which do away with the state altogether. But that's a kind of a long-term vision. And you can argue for borderless South Asia and all sorts of stuff. But up till that kind of very, very fundamental shift, I think talking about both systemic transformations and reforms is not, I don't think there's a dualism. I don't think there's a dichotomy, depending on what kind of articulations we do. If we say that the labor reforms need to happen in such a way that labor is paid a little bit better, has a little bit better, like capitalism does anyway. Right? Across the world, capitalism knows that it's in serious trouble. So it will create it will say, okay, instead of 40 hours a week, you work for 30 hours a week or whatever. And we'll give you creches in the corporations and stuff like that. It's important to do that. But if we remain there, then of course, we're not asking for the fundamental shifts where capitalism itself is seriously challenged or state domination is seriously challenged. But I think we can do both.
Could I quickly add something
yes, please.
to this discussion? I completely agree with everything that Ashishji said and what you mentioned as well. I think the reformist agenda, what I'd like to add is that the reformist agenda could also sort of very creatively give way to a transformative sort of agenda. But I think the trouble is that very often with the reformist agenda, and if I look at the labor rights space as well, it can be subsumed into kind of just small tinkering with policy, with technocratic kind of discussions, with a very depoliticized way of engaging with state or engaging with capital or engaging with powers to be. If the reformist agenda is just about how to get more benefits, how to get more access, how to change policies here and there, without truly looking at the nature of capital, without truly looking at the nature of the state, which is brutally violent, then I think the limitations of the reformist agenda becomes very constraining. But within the reformist agenda, for example, if a struggle of people is sort of looking at even if they're just looking at better wages or better work conditions, but if those are obtained through a contentious politics, it is obtained through collective bargaining, through the collective empowerment of the working class people, then it tends, and this has been the experience of many unions, it tends to kind of go beyond just kind of incremental changes. A lot of unions from there have then thought about how to kind of create systems of production cooperatives, etc., which eject themselves from these capitalist wage kind of relations and bring back the control over ownership back to the worker. That's something that we think about in the unions that I'm involved in as well. But that imagination kind of began with the reformist agenda of improving existing wage relations, but approaching the reformist agenda from a politicized, political, collective bargaining point of view, and not just simply tinkering around with the technocratic aspects of policy. So how you approach reform, and therefore how it leads to transformation, then becomes, I think, quite pertinent. I think that's sort of what Ashish was saying as well.
I think this clearly it's not an easy one way or the other, because also one could say that getting them, so if one talks about inclusion of the Adivasi population through their greater participation in political processes and empowering them politically in the sense of greater collective bargaining power. The other way to look at it is, well, then they've lost what Rahul was talking about earlier, which was some of their cultural, in other words, it's a Faustian pact. I have got my rights, but the means are not consistent with the end. Like I've sold my soul in the process. So it's not an easy question to answer, but somehow it seems like this is a profound question that how does one bring justice, but there's also epistemic justice. In other words, my knowledge system has values in it. Some of those values are not material, they are not materialistic. Yeah. Now the terms for seeking justice in this world in which I've been thrust is that I have to play by the rules of the game, and in that process I have to undermine by that. So then the rights that I gain become a tokenism, that they're there, but in a sense I've lost the substance. So I think that's why, again, this question of knowledge, because then knowledge, again, one can reduce knowledge into something that's museumized in a sense. That's or make it instrumental, that okay, these they have these practices which are found to be useful, but then one really has to go to the more profound questions, which is what is their view of reality and their fundamental, and how that in a sense their ontology has a direct bearing on their ethical view of the world, and there needs to be a dialogue even at that level, which I think is what maybe what was shared earlier about some of these worldviews, that, for example, what Gandhi was sharing, because his critique was not just against capitalism; it was against materialism. It was a critique at the level of worldview, and I think then that becomes a question again. But I would urge the speakers, if you all could also respond to the increasing number of questions in writing. Maybe we can, if it's okay, we can move on to the next speakers, and then at the end come back and continue this discussion. Our next speaker for today's webinar is 𝗥𝗲𝗺 𝗃𝗶𝗃𝗀, who is a research officer with Vasundhara Odisha and a member of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. 𝗥𝗲𝗺, you have to unmute yourself.
So Johar everyone, glad to meet you all here. So yeah, it's been an interesting discussion which I have been listening as of now. So starting with I'll start by telling about my name itself, because we are talking about development, identity, policies. So my name is 𝗥𝗲𝗺 𝗃𝗶𝗃𝗀. and I belong to 𝗏𝗃𝗺𝗃 tribe from Odisha. So if I see from my tribal language, that is 𝗏𝗃𝗺, the meaning of my surname means rock. If we see it in Hindi, it is Chattan. The reason behind saying this is that the indigenous communities and the Adivasi and forest dwelling communities are so interrelated with nature that they have elements of nature in their name as well. And when we say that, you know, the forest, land and nature is a source of our identity, which we means that it is also emblemed not only in a way of living but also in our name. And then talking about the area where I come from is more of an extractive developmental project areas. And then I would start by talking about what this extractive developmental projects or development, the connotation of development means for us Adivasi and forest dwelling communities. So often there had been promises in our areas and in many areas where the indigenous communities have been there that, you know, this extractive development projects are happening, and this is a source of employment, and this is a source of development for the indigenous and Adivasi and forest dwelling communities. There had been many resistance, but because of the imposition of this extractive developmental projects, this has been established. Now what I'm going to say is like, there had been resistance, there had been imposition. Now let's go back. What is the current status as of now in my area, if I talk about? So yes, there are extractive developmental projects, but what has been the impact of it? The impact of it has been that the promise of employment is still not there. And if we see about employment, then what happens is that when an industrial area is set up, the more and more population which are engaged in this industrial setup or extractive development is the people, those who are outsiders, those who are brought from the other parts of the country, not the indigenous people themselves. And even if the indigenous people are, and the Adivasi and forest dwelling people are given employment, they are given employment in a very low level of strata, which is again more and more exploitation of them and without giving them proper wage, and also in an unhealthy health condition, which is again violating the human rights and the right to livelihood as well. And talking about livelihood, because of industrial development, that entire area's ecosystem is destroyed. And as you know, rightly said by Professor Arash, that 1,000 million Adivasi and forest dwelling communities are dependent on forest-based livelihoods, and because of this destruction of the ecosystem, which is being done by this extractive developmental projects, the forest, the availability, the quality, and the quantity of the forest-based livelihood also has deteriorated to a larger extent, because the forest-based livelihood is highly dependent on the climatic conditions, and for which the agriculture practices also has been deteriorated because of the emission, both in terms of the air pollution and also liquid solid waste pollution which has happening. So basically it is entirely curtailing the entire sustainable source of livelihood for the indigenous communities, because the because if they were having a kitchen garden in their areas, which was a source of livelihood for them, but because of these emission and these pollutions, the kitchen garden is something they are not able to continue these days because of the large amount of solid and liquid waste. And then talking about, as many of you also spoke about, about the transition in the culture and tradition of the indigenous community, I would like to highlight one particular thing, is that because of this induced way of development, because of this imposition of development, the indigenous communities or the Adivasi and forest dwelling communities are made to feel inferior of their own culture, inferior of their own language. And we need to understand that this has been for years, this imposition has been for years, and that is how it has tended to create an atmosphere where there is self-doubt, and wherein there has been a personal effort, which also has led to deterioration of self-belief, there has been also questioning or transition, if we see, of the traditional knowledge and practices along with culture. But again, if we see this particular area or this particular is because if we see the inflow of the outsiders is so huge that the people who are owner of the land and resources in an area tends out to become a minority because of the majority inflow of the outsider. And when this majority inflow of outsiders happens, they tend to dominate the way of living and making the minorities who were once a majority to kind of self-doubt themselves, self-doubt their traditional knowledge and practices. And I think this particular connotation of developmental paradigm or the impact of imposed development needs to be taken into consideration when we are talking about reimagining or developmental paradigm shift also, because now what the narrative of the indigenous communities or the indigenous youth have tend out to be in terms of the way of living, in terms of their aspiration, need to be reflected as to what has led to that. And for that, I think it is very important to understand their perspective and their worldview, for which it is very important to interact with them, dialogue with them, and for which I think it's very important that there is an intergenerational dialogue within the indigenous communities also. An intergenerational dialogue not only within the indigenous communities of the youth and also the elders, but also an intergenerational dialogue with the entire framework of decision-making process, so that there is a collaborative effort to discuss on the developmental paradigms. It's not only one particular stakeholders who are deciding what policy needs to be done for the indigenous community per se. So now moving ahead, talking more about why we are talking about indigenous communities development, like why is there's so much we are talking about, I think. So one thing which I feel it is very important, or the world has turned this way around, is that because the indigenous communities have been immensely protecting the forest resources, the ecosystem. Now the climate crisis or the climate action discourse which we are talking about is highly dependent on the participation of the indigenous communities. And if we really want to make sure that we are able to go ahead in terms of the climate action strategies, it is very important that the indigenous communities are made an integral part of this climate action strategies, for which again we need to understand that what are this traditional knowledge and practices of the indigenous communities. And I strongly believe that the indigenous youth needs to go back to the community leaders and learn from them and document and preserve this traditional knowledge practices of forest protection. Just few examples which I would like to give is that if I have seen in my own village, also in my own family also, we had water bottles made up of pumpkins and bottle guards. But now, these days, those bottle guards and those pumpkins, water bottle is not there. But the reason is they used to be there. But how do we make water bottles out of pumpkin and bottle guards is a skill. Is a skill which is untapped in this modern society, which I feel. And if that we see, it is an alternative to plastic. And that is what I feel when the entire world is talking about going beyond plastic, or curtailing plastic and going towards eco-friendly way of living, because ultimately we all are so much concerned about climate, because we feel that if we will not work on climate, our entire life is at risk. And in order to save our life, you need to make indigenous people an integral part of climate actions strategies. And in order to make indigenous people an integral part of climate action strategy, you need to first recognize their rights over the land and forest, because only when the indigenous communities are secured, when the rights over the land and forest is secure, they will be able to contribute in the climate action discourse. This entire linkages needs to be understood when we are talking about development, and when we are talking about climate action, when we are talking about sustainable development goals, because sustainable development goals cannot be achieved, I feel, if the indigenous communities or the local communities or the forest dwelling communities and Adivasi and forest dwelling communities are not taken as an integral part of the stakeholders. Having said that, I also feel when we are talking about COVID-19 recovery and what we need to reimagine, one instances which I came across, COVID-19's interaction with the leader of the women-led cooperatives of forest-based livelihood. She said that we are really pained to see our own community members, those who had gone to cities. They are currently struggling for food and shelter at this particular moment. But we are here safe and secure because we are near the forest. I think this was a very powerful statement, which also made me personally reflect, because ultimately we are going ahead in modernization, globalization, which everyone and this development paradigm is pushing forward. But we need to reflect that what is a sustainability quotient and where the entire earth will be sustainable. Having said that, I strongly feel what is sustainability for indigenous communities, what is development for indigenous community. I strongly feel that for us, it is to be with a forest. For us, it is to know about a language. For us, it is to know about a traditional knowledge and practices. And this will only be able to do only when a rights over a land and forest is recognized. And for that, if I see that if I say of induced development has also led us, made most of us distant from our own roots of land and the agriculture patterns of living, which we were again sustainable because of those agriculture patterns of forest-based livelihood. I think it is very important, specifically for the indigenous youth. Yes, we may have distinct aspiration because we all are an individual or a human being altogether. But I feel we need to make sure that the opportunities and options are explored, and that is where everyone's roles come in, to make sure these opportunities are distinctly discussed and respected. I think that is very important, because now even if there is opportunities, that menial or demeaning those opportunity is making the indigenous youth or the indigenous community choose other paths. For example, now the forest-based livelihood, I see it's a source of way to go ahead in terms of green economy. When we all are talking about green economy, it's the only way we can recover about green economy. But I think for agriculture in that matter, the sustainable or the rotational agriculture which they had with the various varieties of agriculture crops. And when I talk about forest-based livelihood, which is alternated to plastic, also making leaf plates, making chairs and tables, carpets out of leaves. These are entrepreneurial skills which can be given to indigenous communities also. But I would also, as I conclude, would like to emphasize on free, prior and informed consent of the indigenous communities when we are talking about developmental paradigms and sustainability. Just one last example which I would give is that often there has been, imposition of more and more afforestation plans when we talk about climate action or when we talk about development and sustainability also, for which I would like to say that when I had gone to field visit in Mayurbhanj district of Odisha, so there I interacted with the community leader of that village, and he said that people had come here for compensatory afforestation, but we resisted, and we told them we resisted for this compensatory afforestation in our own village. I said, why did you resisted? What were the plants that they brought? So they said they had brought mango trees and they had brought jackfruit trees. I said, mango and jackfruit is fruit trees, they are good, right? Why did you deny those plantation in your area? Then the community leader said that if we grow mangoes and jackfruit in the periphery of our village, the wild animals will come to have those fruits and destroy our agriculture areas or the agriculture crops which we have grown. So this is a perspective, even being from the indigenous communities, I was not aware because I was not in that ecosystem. I was not living in that area. And that is why it is very important to understand that free, prior, informed consent is so very important in any developmental project or any policy framework we are discussing. Because even if the ethnicity or the community belongingness is the same, but the distinct geographical location makes it different in terms of the perception, in terms of the understanding. And that is how I strongly feel that the indigenous people needs to be given over the local areas, authorities over the land, and if we are really talking about development, reimagining, and also need to emphasize, and now we need to make sure that if the major one of the crisis is the climate crisis, if we really want to combat climate crisis, work towards climate action, is the indigenous community who needs to be forefront. And for them to be in the forefront and continue what they are doing, it's very important to recognize their rights over the land and forest.
Thank you so much, Archana. This was again very thought-provoking, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to discuss some of the issues that you have raised. Our last speaker on this panel is our professor. Hopefully will help bring together some of the insights and has the last word on this panel. Professor Shailendra is a professor of economics at the Institute of Rural Management, Anand. His area of interests are rural development, sustainable livelihood, microfinance, rural finance, and governance. Professor Shailendra. You need to unmute yourself, Professor.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, all of you. Yeah. So thanks, Dr. Arash, for inviting me. It was really fantastic listening to all these speakers having such rich insights and experience. I'm not an expert in the Adivasi or indigenous people field. I have done some studies in Gujarat and also in Chhattisgarh. So in this presentation, I'm going to share findings from a research study. In fact, all the aspects, particularly like Priyanka and even Professor Kothari, they were all sharing some of the larger questions. So I would like to probably nuance those with some data from my research, right? Particularly on the migration aspects and the impact of COVID. Yeah, so broadly, are you able to see my PPT, Professor Arash?
No, let me just...
Let's see, are you able to see?
Okay, now please try now.
Yeah. Okay.
Not yet. No. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, if that is there, then that's fine, right? Okay. Yeah. So broadly, yeah, my presentation would cover these 4 or 5 aspects. Yeah, I will of course try and restrict myself to the time limit that is given, about 15 minutes, right? Of course, we as teachers, of course, I'm sitting in a classroom, we are given 90 minutes. This 10-15 minutes for teachers sometimes is difficult. But anyway, since I'm I'm a student here, I'm trying to learn. So let me also, in some sense, go along with other participants. Okay, broadly, yeah, these 5 aspects, right? Yeah, this is the kind of context that we have. The note, of course, that Arash shared is a good reflection of the challenges and dilemmas of Adivasi development in India. Of course, Dr. Ashish's presentation also in many ways brought about these dilemmas of mainstreaming, the so-called mainstreaming versus the autonomous development of indigenous community, right? And of course, the experience is there before all of us, all kinds of, we in some way, we have not given all the kinds of policies, we have not been able to resolve this dilemma. So therefore, all kinds of distortions have come in, distortions in the ecology, distortions in the society, distortions in the culture, right? in a major way affecting the livelihoods of Adivasis, right? So therefore, Adivasis, even as per the official data, they remain as one of the most poorest communities, vulnerable communities. So now, of course, we have this COVID-19, right? So there was already a kind of a social isolation that was there, right, for the Adivasis. So now we can add this social distancing, social and economic distancing that has happened with COVID and lockdown. It's a kind of a double whammy for the Adivasis. It's a major kind of a impact that has happened, particularly for those who are dependent on migration. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the findings of a longitudinal study. It's an ongoing study, right? Of course, that study is a larger study covering other villages also, but for the purpose of this seminar, I have just focused on only one tribal or Adivasi village. It's a Adivasi village in the Dahod district, which borders, of course, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, the 3 states, right? And some of the insights that Priyanka or even the other speakers were sharing from this belt, right? So in some way, they kind of reinforce my findings, right? So it's for that larger belt, Bhil community or the Adivasi belt. So this village belongs there, though it's a single village study here for this purpose. But in a sense, it is given the kind of also the sharings, a representative of the scenario that prevails over there in the tribal tracts of Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Madhya Pradesh. Right, yeah, so this is the village location. So it's in the Dahod district, right? Dahod district, and it borders, as I said, Rajasthan in the north and Madhya Pradesh on the east, right? Yeah, so as I said that, yeah, a little more about this study. Of course, this study, the first phase of that was done in 1994. It was part of a larger study on rural livelihood systems and understanding their links with the natural resources. So we had selected multiple villages in Gujarat, and one of the villages that we selected was this tribal village. Right, of course, given its own uniqueness, right? The tribal villages, they have their own challenges and uniqueness. So we had selected 2 tribal villages. So, and then I have been, in some sense, tracking these villages over the years, right? At least 3 rounds of studies I have made here, right? In the last 25 years. So right now, therefore, I completed just before COVID a survey of these villages, including this village, right? And in that sense, it's a kind of a longitudinal kind of an insight into as to what has happened to livelihoods in these villages and in this tribal village also. Because when I'm saying livelihood, it covers all aspects, not only the natural resources, the occupation, the society, education. The study is a kind of a comprehensive kind of an assessment. And I should be able to complete that in a year, by next year or so. And I had already published one book based on the earlier study. So this is in some sense an updation of that earlier work during this period, 94 to 2019. In a sense, it is also the period that coincides with this reforms and liberalization. It's also therefore going to bring out some of the insights that some of the speakers were throwing, right? What has happened to tribal livelihoods under liberalization and globalization. So my interest of conducting this repeat study in all these villages was also to capture the impact of these major trends at the policy level. Okay, so that is the kind of a background of for this study, and straight away let me go into my findings. Yes, this is the location. Yes, as you can see in terms of the population, right? So this village, right? There is of course increasing pressure of population. So there is almost threefold increase in the last 2.5 decades, 25 years, almost threefold increase in the population. So therefore the density of population is going up, so that is adding to the pressure there. So one can also see the increase in the household size, while in general household size are coming down, but here the household size is going up, right? Of course, that is also a strategy because they don't want to split their resources. So they're trying to live together. Though population has increased 3 times, but households have not increased 3 times. So that is a kind of an insight that they are trying to live together. So therefore, the families have become bigger there. But overall, yes, there is a pressure of population, right? And that can be seen from the density of population also worked out for this village. Of course, these are all preliminary findings. They are subject to some of the revisions, final revisions when I finally analyze the data, right? And an interesting aspect about demography is the sex ratio. So the recent years have seen decline in the sex ratio. My first survey had shown over 1,000 as the sex ratio, but now we see that it has come down to 958. So it is somewhat catching up with the mainstream in terms of the sex ratio, right? As that is also a matter of concern. Of course, literacy has increased, but not in terms of the quality, overall quality. I'm also looking at education in this study, in this and other villages. The literacy has increased, enrollments have increased, but education overall has declined, has deteriorated. And COVID has even made a major kind of impact there, a negative impact, right? With schools not working and children are not able to engage themselves with the learning process, right? So what has happened to the resources? This is what many of the speakers were also sharing, right? The resource base. So I've also looked at the resource base of this village, both at the common level and also at the household level. Now, one major thing is that, yes, with the increasing population, resource base is declining, both of course in the quantitative sense and also in the qualitative sense, right? The land holdings have declined. Of course, forest area, though 1/3, it's a degraded forest. Even JFM that was introduced there could not make much of an impact, right? Yeah, so land resource, animal resource, trees per farm, all of them have declined. Of course, there are many reasons for this. Of course, declining landholding is largely because of the fragmentation and increasing population. But partly that has also contributed for declining animals and declining trees on farms. Earlier, of course, trees were an important source. This is on their own private farms. So the forests have degraded. Forests have got degraded despite the JFM, right? And what is happening to the occupation, right? When I say livelihoods, right? Of course, I'm just showing only the kind of a broader kind of findings without going into the details. Yeah, so though agriculture, of course, all of them own land, but these lands are smaller, right? Now less than 2 acres, right? Of course, it's not that easy also to collect data, but whatever data that we have collected, yeah, they are small pieces of land. Almost all of them own land, right? All of them also own livestock, though livestock proportion of households owning livestock has declined. But their livelihoods are getting diversified. Right? Particularly, so the proportion of households into agriculture labor is increasing, right? And then proportion of households into non-farm occupations has significantly increased. But the major source of livelihood, migration, percentage of households migrating, which was 76% in '94, has now gone up to 87% in the village. So this is also an important kind of a change or impact that has happened over the years, right? And of course, the nature of jobs I was trying to look at, yes, though. Particularly with the liberalization. So of course, I have not been able to get this classification for 1994, but much of it is in the unorganized sector, right? Particularly migrants and all. They are all casual workers working in the in a very difficult kind of a situation. So some bit of increase in self-employment also has increased, but government and public sector kind of employments literally have squeezed out. If at all there are any kinds of government jobs, it is all mainly ASHA workers, Anganwadi workers, school teachers, etc., who are also mostly on contract basis. So organized sector employment is literally not just available. Therefore, they are forced to depend on informal kind of sources of employment, and more so here by way of migration. Yeah. So just looking at, of course, this is data which, of course, Priyanka was sharing qualitative insights. My study, in some sense, reinforces those qualitative insights by way of some data for this village. Yes. As we can see, 86% migrating. This has increased compared to 1994. Right, female migration also remains significantly high, right? Though marginally it is declined now, only by 4%. But number of migrants per household has increased, 2.2 to 2.9. Though number of days are lower, right? Number of days are lower. So one major kind of finding is that now migration contributes the major source of income for these households. Though agriculture is also there, agriculture and little bit of self-employment and animal husbandry is there, but they constitute smaller percentage of the total income. So therefore migration is the major source of livelihood, and though it's a major source, but in terms of the nature of it, the kind of conditions under which they work and all, as Priyanka was sharing, it's just not good, not desirable at all, right? Of course, this is highly circulatory, seasonal kind of migration, as we can see, right? So they different people migrate in different seasons, right? Most, of course, migrate for more than 2 seasons. So that as overall has increased, right? Number of seasons migrating, and yes, though now they are involved in diverse kind of occupation. Construction has remained the major source of employment under migration, almost same percentage in 1994 and 2009. Of course, I have worked out both for household and labor force. So this I'm giving it for the labor force, right? Labor force. So you can see that 82% were in construction, variety of construction, road work, infrastructure, and several such kinds of things which have also got diversified, and that remains same. This is the kind of segmentation also which Priyanka rightly identified. The bills, particularly the Adivasis from this belt, are largely involved in construction kind of a work. They're unable to diversify, though there is some bit of a diversification into factory and other work, but largely it is construction which is absorbing this labor force, and that has become quite handy for them, in terms of their exploitation. See the kind of the change that has happened despite all the liberalization, all the globalization. We were telling that there will be a lot of jobs and trickle down would happen, which has not happened. It has remained same. The status has remained almost the same. 25 years is not a small period, right? So all the reforms, all the liberalization for the tribals. So this is the kind of change possibly that we can see. So as things change, things remain same. That we can possibly say. As things change, things remain same. This table is a very clear depiction of that. Of course, where are they going? They are mostly going to different towns. Now, some of them also go outside Gujarat, but most of them go to different locations, including Ahmedabad, which is now Ahmedabad and Gandhinagar belt, which Priyanka highlighted. That is on the major destination for them. Yeah, it's all small towns, larger towns, wherever the work is there. So there is a pattern as to why they go, which I'm not going to share. So what are the reasons? What are the reasons? Of course, currently I'm trying to analyze what are the reasons. My previous book had identified these 5 reasons as to what are the factors leading to migration, seasonal distress migration. And I would here say that, in fact, these reasons remain same, and they have become even more acute. These reasons remain same, right? Declining land availability, growing population, including social obligations like bride price and risk effort to reduce risk because of drought and problematic agriculture and limited local employment opportunities. All of them still remain same despite 25 years of liberalization. They have not changed there, at least in this belt, in this village, significantly, and they have become more acute, and therefore seasonal migration, which is definitely a very extracting, exploitative nature, continues. So what does, of course, where do they stay? Priyanka was telling, yes, my data shows 82% stayed in open spaces in 1997. Almost same, though there is slightly multiple kind of locations, but open space still is more than 75%. They just stay there. You ask them, where do you stay? Kullama. Where do you stay? Kullama. That is their response, common response, right? And there is no water, no toilet, nothing, and none of them are bothered. All the laws are just thrown to winds. All the laws are just thrown to winds. Yeah, let me quickly complete. Yes, of course, what is the impact of it? Of course, migration continues. There is no transformational change, right? So only they are trying to improve their housing conditions. And you can see they want to build some good houses. They are building houses for everyone in Ahmedabad, Anand, Baroda, etc. They also want to improve their housing. But that still is not showing much of a result, though some of them were able to improve their housing. But these houses are also highly incomplete, having no best facilities. They're all minimum basic structure, though they call them as RCC. Yeah, that is their aim, build an RCC house for themselves. Yeah, so in this kind of a context, COVID has come, right? So 68% of the income comes from COVID. So what is the kind of a scenario? So therefore in 2019 and 20, based on my survey, so there is a severe impact on migration because of the decline in the construction sector. Construction sector declined by 50%. So therefore 2019 and 20, severe and negative impact on migration. Local non-farms also declined. Agriculture to some extent declined. And I'm visualizing what is going to happen in 2020, right? Yeah, so agriculture, there will be problem. Non-agricultural sector will not thrive. Demand will be lower. Migration would be lower, and education is one which has suffered. It has suffered severely, and it will continue to remain in this negative kind of a situation, right? So therefore, overall, as I said, liberalization reforms had not improved their situation. COVID now has worsened. And it is going to, their livelihoods are going to deteriorate further, and they are going to be into much higher kind of exploitation and squeezing, and what about the relief government has announced, how much it is reaching? I try to look at the Pradhan Mantri 𝗕𝗓𝗃𝗃 Yojana, which they announced in March, right? How much it is reaching, right? So the reach varies across. The reach varies.
Professor, if you could just conclude in 1 minute.
Concluding 1 minute. So the reach of these schemes are very limited. So therefore, even there also, therefore, there is a squeeze. Yeah. So this is my final slide. So what I would say, yes, of course, the declining resource base and growing population has increased distress, right? So despite reforms have brought in only proletarianization, right? So they are becoming more and more of, though they want to be peasants, they consider themselves as peasants in the villages, but in the urban areas, they are just labor force, they're invisible labor force, right? Only this COVID has, in fact, made us open our eyes, right? Yeah, but migration also has not helped, right? There is no transformational impact, despite some of the local interventions like JFM, lift irrigation, which I have studied. Lift irrigation to some extent has reduced migration. It has reduced distress migration, but very, very limited kind of an impact, right? Very, very limited kind of an impact. All of them now have been reversed by COVID, and relief schemes have a limited impact. So therefore, the way forward is, yeah, of course, it requires intervention at various levels. The larger economy level, the way economy has impacted, the liberalization have impacted, but at the local level, in terms of improving the resource base, giving access to access and control, and having localized participation and governance right structures in all these organizations. And I would recommend collectivization of agriculture. So that is one way forward to improve the local base. Collectivization of agriculture, including FPOs, etc. right? So organization of migrants in towns is important. Nobody, except for some NGOs, nobody is looking at them. They are at the mercy of this construction industry. They are squeezing them. They are squeezing them. And of course, invest in education, in a holistic education, including Adivasi education. And of course, overall, we need employment-oriented growth. Otherwise, I would say, even in the coming decades, even if I go after 2 decades, possibly they will be in the same situation. Even if I go after two more decades, the situation will remain same. So these are some of the findings, which is in some sense supporting some of the arguments made by earlier speakers. So thank you very much. I'm sorry for rushing through, so I couldn't help. Thanks, Professor Arash, for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Professor Shailendra. This was a very useful study that you shared, which provides some an actual picture, a snapshot of this village and the case of some of the concrete issues which these Adivasi communities face. So because we are almost towards the end of our time, I just wanted to open the floor to our panelists if they would like to share their last word before we conclude, some thoughts or insights that they would like to share. Maybe we could have one from each speaker.
Professor, stop sharing his screen, then we'll...
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, is that fine? Okay.
You're still sharing your screen. You have to stop sharing.
Oh, where is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is good. Yeah, yes.
Okay. Yeah, hello all of you. Yes, now we are face to face.
So I don't know if maybe we could, who would like to be the first one? Archana, would you like? Yes, please.
Yeah. So my final remarks or final thoughts is, I strongly feel we need to reflect and dialogue on, when we talk about development and Adivasi communities, we need to reflect and have a dialogue on development for whom, development by whom, and development for what needs to be reflected. And I really feel if this development has no sustainable benefits for the indigenous communities, the development should not happen in the land of indigenous communities and the Adivasi and forest dwelling communities. I say sustainable benefits for Adivasi and forest dwelling communities because most of the time people see jobs and compensation as a sustainable benefits. But I would like to differ from that is not sustainable benefits, because at one certain point of time that compensation you have will be over. The jobs will be, you will not be able to continue jobs because of your age and other factors and the health concerns. And it's the land which stays with you and which is a sustainable source of your livelihood when we talk about indigenous communities, and hence the development should not deprive the indigenous and Adivasi forest dwelling communities from the land and forest, and rather ensure that how they can have a sustainable way of living in their land and forest.
Thank you, Archana. Would someone else like to go ahead? Their comments?
Can I add to what? Sorry, was somebody else saying?
Yes, please, Ashish, go ahead.
Okay, I mean, completely agreeing with what Archana said, and adding to it, saying that I think it's also a question of how we view development for everybody, which includes non-Adivasis, and in fact, even more importantly, because it's when we think of development as something in which we keep increasing our material consumption and our energy consumption and so on, Adivasi areas will not survive. No I mean, not just Adivasi, but basically the planet won't survive. So, and even if, for instance, we are completely leave Adivasi areas alone, the impacts of our lifestyles through climate crisis and so on are such that it will be felt by Adivasis, even if they are like completely autonomous and so on. We know that. We know that even, for instance, with wildlife, you can have a strictly protected national park, but frog species are disappearing inside it because of climate change happening 1,000 kilometers away. So it seems to me that unless we completely challenge our own ways of life, the dominant ways of life and dominant systems of so-called development, etc., nothing is going to survive. Which then also means that we have to, a number of questions in the question and answer, which I've tried to respond to, have been this thing of how do we ensure Adivasi cultures, etc., while also integrating them into modern science and technology or modern life and so on. And I am saying, why don't we put it the other way around? Why don't the rest of us learn from Adivasi societies and change our ways of living and being and relating to nature and relating to each other? Why does it have to be the Adivasis who have to be able to adopt to and still survive and keep their identity and adopt to our, and with the climate crisis, I think this becomes so much more evident that we are the ones who have to change. It's our challenge as much as it's a challenge of the Adivasis. Second and very quick comment is that I really like the study that Professor showed us. And I would say that I think researchers need to also study much more in depth the kind of community responses coming from Adivasis where they're trying to solve these issues, where they're trying to create collective systems of self-governance with their own economic and political thinking, trying to reassert their identity and so on. How have those worked? What kind of obstacles have they overcome? Have they figured out how to deal with land fragmentation? So for instance, 𝗕𝗂𝗃𝗀𝗃, which I spoke about, is possibly one of the first villages in India that has completely commonized all its lands. There is no private agricultural land in that village anymore. And they've used an old law, the 𝗕𝗏𝗃𝗀𝗃 Act, to do that. So how have these things worked? What processes of discussion went through it? What kind of dialogue? What external enabling factors were or were not there? What kind of leadership enabled that to happen? How did the Forest Rights Act get implemented? How did it come up with the first place, as Rahul said, and then how did it actually get implemented in some of these areas? I think we need a lot more studies with and by the local people, with help from people like Professor Shailendra and others, to get these stories also out, because that will inspire then many more such initiatives, hopefully, across the country. Thank you.
Yeah, can I say?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, yeah, first of course, the comment by Dr. Ashish, right? Yeah, I have also tried to look at the working of some of the collective institutions in these villages. I have studied the JFM, the water users cooperative, the LAMP working of LAMP there, right? And certain informal kind of associations which have come up there, right? Because my study here, just I was trying to focus largely on migration and COVID impact, but I have covered all aspects. In fact, I myself, because I went back to this village to study the longitudinal change on all aspects. Because in 1994, I had seen how bride price is to Bride Price and 𝗕𝗏𝗃𝗀𝗃, which is a collective thing, 𝗕𝗏𝗃𝗃𝗃, how they still continue to play. So I have looked at all these formal and informal collectives and associations. Maybe some other time when I complete my study, I would be able to share with you, right? They're really insightful the way they are changing. And in my overall take on, yes, the changes, as an, of course, as a social scientist, right? So I would, in fact, look at, of course, the kind of questions that Dr. Harash has posed. So I would look at the two levels. One, of course, the larger the dynamics that is unfolding globally and within our country in terms of the capitalistic development, that is subsuming much of all these things, right? So the way, as I said, that in 25 years, so things have changed. things have remained same, and they are getting subsumed much faster and in a much significant way. So unless we develop countervailing forces against these larger forces, right? So some of the local efforts, etc., will not be effective, right? So it is a two-way kind of a strategy: countervailing forces against the larger forces, including labor exploitation. Of course, the exploitation of resources, natural, all of them which are going, so that we need to somehow counter them. And then yes, many such grassroots initiatives, right? More autonomy, decentralized governance in all fields, natural resources, agriculture, right? So in all fields, panchayats, right? Various fields, this decentralized governance and scope for participation. Right? They say that, of course, what Archana has been emphasizing, so that is important. So therefore, it is for me a kind of a two-way, a kind of a challenge and two-way way forward, right? So that's how I would put it, the challenge of Adivasi communities. And they must be there, in addressing, particularly when we say grassroots mobilization. So there, yes, they must have the say, and although there are a lot of dichotomies there, a lot of dichotomies which I have seen, particularly in the context of some of the political mobilization that is happening, right? Some of them are also not in right direction, so they are also throwing up challenges, and they are adding to many of these contradictions and challenges. So it's a major kind of a thing. So therefore, a more decentralized participatory approach would possibly would be way forward, and that would be more meaningful given the experience so far. Yeah, with that I conclude. Thank you very much.
Yes, please go ahead.
See, the major problem is one of investment. You know, in the country, 67%, 65% of the people live in rural areas, but the GDP there is just 16%. So that's why this migration is there, and that's all planned. That's a planned kind of thing. There's this concept in Marx that is primitive accumulation. That is how it starts. That you don't have unionization. You don't have unionization. You can extract as much as possible from the labor. And that process has gone on, and India today is like that. That is why there is this, and deliberately they have been made invisible. Because if they become visible, if they are unionized, then you have to give them all kinds of, the employers and the state both have to give a lot of resources which they don't want to give. So that, without that being addressed, without that problem being addressed, that capitalism today is based on primitive accumulation, there is nothing you can do. I mean, you are not allowed to unionize. You know, we have tried to unionize people from our areas because they go for migration. You're not, because the laws, first of all, laws are outdated. Whatever was there, that also is going away. You go to the courts, they are not helpful. They won't help you. So all these things, this is a larger framework in which, you know, this whole problem of migration that is there, that is a planned kind of thing, which is very difficult to do anything. Similarly, there's another area where it is very difficult to work, which is sustainable agriculture. You know, the agriculture throughout the world has become unsustainable, and it is being carried on through huge subsidies, whether it is the US, whether it's the Europe, or whether it is India. You know, the whole chemical agriculture, which is destructive, which is unsustainable, is being maintained through subsidies. So now in that kind of a situation, if you, like in our area, we are trying to do sustainable agriculture. The problem is that farmers do not want to do this sustainable agriculture because they have been hooked into this other system, which is supported. There is no support. So this, how do you create a sustainable system, decentralized system, when the whole centralized system is so powerful and it is bent on, you know, destroying nature? So there were some questions that how, you know, you are going to implement and all that. Then you can't do anything because at the larger level, this kind of unsustainability is going on. And the moment you try to, our experiences that with the moment we are trying to, you know, organize and get to a higher level, you are crushed through police action. And now you have the UAPA. In our time, I mean, we went to jail so many times, but we got bail and came out. But now you have a situation where they put in UAPA in which you can't get bail. And the UAPA, it is important to discuss this here, that the UAPA is that if somebody is arrested and he gives a statement that Rahul was also with me, then which is not admissible in the trial. But at the arrest level, at the initial level, you can be arrested, and then you won't get bail because the UAPA provision is such. So these are things that you have to consider. I mean, you can go on debating out here. We have decentralized systems and this and that and all that. But when you actually go on the ground, even in Western Madhya Pradesh now, just a few days back, 2 or 3 days back, there's a huge rally in one area because Forest Rights Act is not being implemented properly. There's this Jagrit Adivasi Dalit Sangathan, and they took out a rally and all that, and they were thrashed, and people were put in jail. Luckily, no UAPA was put on them. But this is the response of the state and the corporates and all that. This whole migration problem, everybody's saying that so much things, but that's part of the plan, that and the response of the state after that they have no data. They have no data on how many migrants are there, how many have been killed. So we have to realize that the state system is very vitiated, and I personally don't know how it can be made more responsive. Thank you.
Yes, Priyanka, you have the last word.
It's hard to follow up from what Rahulji said because it's so true and it's so excruciating. Because it is overwhelming, the structures are overwhelming, and I agree that the way migration is induced in the country, it is very much part of what we call development strategy, the way the state sees it. Keeping people desperately poor is very much part of the strategy, and kind of making sure that any material basis of life which prevents people from being desperately poor and therefore having their desperation utilized is very much part of the development paradigm. So operating in that environment, building up resistance on the ground in that environment it's a mind-boggling task. But if we kind of invert the gaze a little bit and kind of think about the whole, and this was part of what I spoke about, I remain a bit preoccupied by that. What are the mechanics of our praxis? What are the mechanics of this resistance? And when it comes to Adivasi communities, I think at least as an outsider, I feel our understanding is very, very preliminary and maybe also very misplaced. There are forms of resistance. There are the community's own ways of building solidarities with each other, but the overlap of that with work, the overlap of that with the labor market is not visible. The pathways of that are not understood properly. How do you build on these forms of resistance to be able to overturn some of the structural kind of issues of the labor market is very, very nascent work, I think, as far as Adivasi communities are concerned. I don't think we even begin to understand what the perception, and of course all individuals might perceive this, but to the extent that there might be a common experience of freedom amongst a particular Adivasi group or amongst Adivasis, how do they perceive, how do they experience freedom within work is also something that we don't understand, I think. So I think the agenda is a huge one, and it starts with very basic fundamental things as far as at least the labor market or working class struggle is concerned.
Thank you so much to all our panelists and our speakers. I think one thing that I'd like to share from an insight that came from one of our previous webinars was that experience has shown that although, like what our panelists shared, the challenge is formidable and there are huge structural impediments in terms of the forces that are faced by those who are seeking to bring about change. I think one thing that was shared in our earlier webinar was that experience has shown that work at the grassroots level, when it is pursued with perseverance and doggedly pursued, it creates a demand for certain types of policies which are just and which reflect these principles of sustainability and participation. And it may be that the macro policy framework may be under various influences for the time being. However, when there is demand on the ground, with time, policy will catch up. And so in a sense, the insight that was shared was that the work that civil society groups are doing in terms of like I think Professor Shailendra was sharing, these different hopeful experiments with grassroots level, collective farming, for example. One looks at the economic aspect, or different other forms of grassroots initiatives. Some of them initiated by the civil society, some even by the state, like the 𝗕𝗂𝗶𝗃𝗀𝗵 movement in Kerala. So the idea was that what one also needs is more and more prototypes of workable ideas. In a sense, one needs to begin to see what it looks like for change to be given a concrete form, for a different form of development, like what Ashish was saying. And then with those prototypes, it becomes easier to bargain for changes at the larger policy level. I'd like to thank all our panelists and our participants who patiently have been part of this webinar. This is, as I mentioned in the beginning, the third in a series, and we hope to have one every month, looking at a certain aspect of development, especially in the context of the pandemic.